Good afternoon, everybody. You've made it through most of PG Connect's pretty amazing event so far. I've heard tons of good stuff. I hope I can live up to the standard that's been set before me at PG Connect. We are primarily interested in, we're an artificial intelligence company, but we're deeply interested in games, right? So we ask ourselves, why do people play games? Why do we get involved here? And I think it always starts, right, with a narrative, with a story. So people are always going to get involved because there's a core story that speaks to them. And then there are layers that evolve around that story, right? Then you've got challenges and you've got surprises that happen, right? Once you work your way through a certain period of the game, you figure you've got it mastered, then something unexpected happens and the game evolves and changes and becomes more challenging. So there's a sort of opening up of the game as you play within it. You begin to achieve a level of mastery at the end, right? There's this achievement where you go, hey, I'm pretty good at this now. And this for us is sort of fundamental to the work we all do. Now, then we ask ourselves, well, why do we build them? And I think as people, we're storytellers, right? We've got something that we want to talk about, something that we want to express, something that we think needs representing in the world, and we're excited for people to hear that story or let that story unfold for them and see how they can connect with it, see what it means to them. And so now as we look at AI, this too has been a story in gaming, right? The world of AI in gaming hasn't always been a rosy one. So like all good stories, it began a long time ago with this overwhelming enemy, right? And that enemy was the bot, right? Everybody's had problems with bots, right? You faced them in some game, you've been screwed over because you were at that point and something was going to happen and then it all went horribly wrong, right? So when bots, when we speak of bots in gaming, right? And people are like, oh, AI means bots. It has, right? But at the end of the day, what causes problems with a story in a game is when a bot masquerades as a human, when it takes on the role, when it sort of surreptitiously acts under the guise of a human and sneaks into the game and distorts the mechanics, right? So when it's masquerading as a human, you can no longer, you can tell by its behavior that there's something wrong here, but the fairness goes downhill, right? And your enjoyment of the game is materially impacted. And your achievements are taken away, it goes to the top of the leaderboard, and all of that stuff that makes the game valuable to us as players starts to disappear, right? And ultimately it hijacks the story and it ruins the environment. So when we say, hey, we do AI in gaming, there's this kind of visceral reaction, understandably, because we've all been in that place where that's happened to us. Then the enemy transformed and has evolved, right? Because gaming, now that artificial intelligence has moved to a new level, different things are happening. And I suspect that a lot of you may have seen what happened with at the International this past year with Dota 2, where OpenAI brought a whole new level of competitive bots. And this is just a small snippet of play where I think all of us were probably shocked by the ability of the bots to engage in teamwork, the ability of the bots or the willingness of the bots to run and just sacrifice themselves for the team, right? This is not something that we as humans are great at. If you're playing along on a team of 5 people, nobody wants to be the guy who jumps on the grenade. But these bots were really, really fine with doing that, right? They didn't have a problem engaging in very inhuman behavior, and it made them very successful. So, and the bots, because they learned the game in their own way, started to play different strategies, started to kind of unlock strategies that players hadn't encountered before, and that was part of the reason that it was successful. Now, since this particular bot had in the sort of little brain cell, the LSTM cell that kind of figures out how things unroll over time, that had 1,024 neurons in it. Within weeks of this, then they had expanded to 2048, and then the 4096, and guess what? It became even much more performant. So there's a lot going on with these bots, but the really fascinating thing is it's not what it used to be, right? It can't just imitate and do a few hard-coded actions. It can do a whole lot more. So now we need a hero, right? We need something new in gaming that sort of aligns these forces. And our view on that is language is the key to that, right? We think that AI changes or sort of will unlock a lot of new dynamics. And the way it's going to do that is because we're going to be able to control the AI, right? And the story behind this kind of started with, I've got a son who's almost 7 now. And as I started to look at his future, right, and say, well, wait a minute, AI coming up and replacing people and overtaking all these tasks and beating humans, it's not a world that we think is great, right? Fundamentally, we don't think it's great for gaming. We don't think it's great for people. So we started to say, well, wait a minute, if all this power is there, then let's give people the ability to shape it. And what happens is power, everything becomes better, right? We get, through bringing these new dynamics, I think we're going to see some really fascinating things evolve. We're going to see people interact differently with games and and discover things about themselves and about the world that they really didn't perceive before. And that covers a range of stuff. So we think that in these human and AI interactions, right, once you have language as a sort of bond between them, the agent can become much more aligned with the way humans see the world. So they can start to, if you think of things like Diablo, right, where you've got the little guy who's trailing along behind you and he's going to tell you something. So he's necessary to the game, but he's actually a drag on play because he's not good at anything, right? And you'd wish for somebody who was. And you feel like you deserve somebody who's going to look after you, right? Rather than this guy who kind of does random stuff at the back. So we think that having intelligent agents that can not only fulfill a certain static role, but evolve with you and sort of come to serve you better, we think that's a really interesting dynamic. And I think game developers with their own stories are going to come up with ways to use that are fascinating, that are going to lead to really deep experiences in the game. The next angle is this new interface of voice, right? If you look at the way people are playing Fortnite now and how much chatter is going on, this is a big deal, right? People are interacting using voice massively now, right? They're used to it because of Alexa. They're getting into it because of Fortnite. So your potential players are out there using their voice all the time. But there's not really been a way for game and voice to work together because Alexa sucks, right? That's not, Alexa, the problem with Alexa is every command, the result is always a little bit disappointing, right? The thing about a reinforcement learning agent is the result can actually be better than you think, right? Because the agent is going to have its own, it's like, okay, you want me to do this, and it's going to try to figure out how to maximize that. That too is a really interesting dynamic, and we were looking at, I was listening to some great esports people talk in the other room, and they were talking about how important the story is, right, of what's happening. And this is, there's an opportunity here for this interaction to become more interesting. So we see how these teammates can boost engagement by following their leader, right? So being, like this guy in Diablo, instead of being this kind of static, uninformed guy, you can start to shape more of the game, start to engage more with the game, and lead players on a more interesting journey. Also, the intelligence in these agents and the fact that intelligence evolves means that your player gets to wrap the story kind of up in their own, they get to take ownership of the story, right? They get to perceive it through their own eyes and kind of shape it. And we think that leads to a lot of opportunities, as well as just the affection, right? There's something that's there's a reason that Tamagotchi worked, right? All those years ago. People are like, oh, this thing needs me. I have to keep looking after it. Otherwise it'll decay or die or whatever. There's something to that, right? We like to be needed by something. And these agents, it sounds a bit bizarre to speak of an agent in that way, but the fact is we form bonds with the things that serve us. Now this is an example of one of the things we've done. If you look at the little blue guy there on the top, the player is saying, heal me. So the agent figures out, okay, who needs help, and runs around and actively targets and says, so we've taken, essentially this is the StarCraft SC2 LE environment. We turned it into kind of a hack and slash maze game, and we put this agent inside it, trained it, and then we put it, we sort of stuck language on top and got it to understand the way we players think about the world. And all of a sudden you've got an agent that can respond in real time to human input. Now, if you don't give it any input, it'll do its best and it'll just sort of make autonomous choices, but it actually performs better, and you're much more likely to succeed in the game if you actively coach the agent to play alongside you. So will you complete the maze without coaching the agent? Probably not, right? Because it's going to do its best, but it may not be in sync with what you're trying to achieve. But if you work together, it can. Here's another example, and you probably won't be able to hear the audio, but in the next one, you've got the agent who then is asked by the player to block out. So all of a sudden, you'll see him shift from attacking to suddenly blocking out. So this is, and for the player, all of a sudden you've got somebody who's acting on your behalf and who's creating really interesting interactions, right? Which is acting, it's using its own intelligence, right? This isn't, you aren't controlling every motion. We think that unlocks a lot of stuff. And we're humble enough to know that the game developers who have their story to tell are going to take this in a lot of different directions. But we think the fundamental empowerment of saying, look, you can take an agent, you can train it, and then you can tell it what to do is going to lead to some pretty remarkable player experiences. Most importantly, because it makes a player feel awesome, right? It's fun to be the leader. All of us love to have people who will dive on the grenade for us, or follow our lead, or take our mentorship, and that for me is a fundamentally important thing to tie into. It's good to be needed. The other direction, and I'll be very frank, we're just beginning to explore these various dimensions. I don't know if you guys have seen the Unity people. They have their machine learning interface, and they're just sort of conventional reinforcement learning agents, but they did Puppo the Corgi, right? So giving non-player characters intelligence. We think if you take that, but then say, look, like hard coding a reward function is something none of us should have to do, right? So the idea here is to take an environment like that, put the agent into it, let it learn itself, and then take this language wrapper over the top and constrain the behavior. So if you want Puppo to go fetch, tell him, right? If I was told in some of the conversations I had these couple of days in Korea, apparently pet games are a big deal. So you've got these little pets that follow you around and things. Well, but there's only so much you can do with point and click. But if you can speak to a pet, there's a lot that you can probably unlock. As well as saying, doing the same thing for agents and saying, in your design process, however you are constructing environments, ultimately I think you're going to see people like us or us be creating tools that say live within Unity that are like, oh, here's what you're trying to do. Can I finish that up for you, right? Do you want to do some more of that? So the goal would be, again, for the agent to intelligently adapt to what it's seeing and to try to replicate that and produce interesting results. We think that leads to better workflows, right? If a game developer can focus on story, then you're going to have, there's going to be more creative output, because you don't have to spend the proverbial glucose on alignment of things and things like that. And as you saw in those couple of clips, the agents can actually be pretty dynamic and effective. This last thing is something that we sort of gave some thought to pre-show, and have found that a lot of people seem to agree with us. That 50% Twitch viewers number comes from somebody who works at Google on a lot of these esports, live streaming, and partnership things, and it was a fascinating number to me. I think I heard this about 6 months ago, and they're like, 50% of people who are watching these games don't even play that game, right? So it's not like they're trying to get better. It's just some of these players are just super watchable, right? Super interesting. And by the way, a lot of the games have super big hurdles, right? If you want to start playing the game, then it's like, okay, let me get started, right? First of all, tutorial, and then this, and then keyboard and mouse. And the first it's immediate pain, right? So, but if you say, okay, let's put an agent in between and start getting involved via the agent. Go straight from Twitch to coaching an agent around the environment to say, oh, hey, I'm playing around, I'm having I'm engaging with the game, I'm starting to enjoy it, and then they can go deeper, right? But to start out with this as a transition layer, again, these are theses that we believe in, but it's starting to, this seems to be such a big pain point for people that they're saying to get involved in a game is just really tough. So, so we think we can do that, as well as taking something like StarCraft and just saying, look, you don't need to rewrite StarCraft. Like Diablo has just had their big, they moved it to mobile and everybody's freaking out. If you look at a game like StarCraft, right, it's very watchable, it has huge viewership in various markets, but again, that hurdle to get involved is so massive. We say, look, take StarCraft, make it playable on mobile using your voice alone, right? You tell the agent what to do, all of a sudden you're getting involved, you're sort of making your way through the world and engaging, and again, it's up to the developers to really figure out what the players are going to think is amazing in terms of experience. But we think that unlocks a lot of stuff. So as well as human AI team modes, right? We're looking at FPS type games where the player plays and has a wingman next to them and says, okay, take that hill. I've got this covered, or I need cover fire. I'm going to go do this, right? And that may create more watchable content. It may, again, just kind of enrich the whole ecosystem and flow of things in this market. So, whereas the old world was, botifying, bots and gaming was always a bad thing. So, so our view is kind of the old world is all Val Kilmer, you can be my wingman anytime, and we are more aligned with Tom Cruise saying, the human should be able to say, bullshit, you can be mine. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Probably got time for a question or two before we assemble our last panel of the day. Does anyone have anything they'd like to ask? Yeah, go for it.
So what are the limitations when you talked about players being able to train bots?
Mm-hmm.
Would they be able to train them to do completely different things from each other? So like one player needs to have his bot do a very specific action and another player a completely different set of actions.
Yeah, ultimately, it all comes down to the training process and how you engage with the bot. So, so if you're playing with your bot and you say, do this, and then do that, and then do that, and don't do this, then there's no reason that can't become, again, the training process. So yeah, you can ultimately behaviorally shape these algorithms because they're, the way they learn from past behavior, that sort of shapes the choices that they make in the future. And you saw that actually with OpenAI, if you, with those Dota 2 bots, they were, in the first couple of games they had, then they went away and they're like, oh no, it's doing badly against Roshan, so we gotta, so they actually went into the game and trained a bunch of stuff overnight, like get the player and let's fight Roshan a bunch of times. And then the next day, it was completely different behavior. So it's very much, and they were doing it, again, they're super talented technical people over at OpenAI, it's a great team. And so they're doing it, technically, we believe that should be accessible to everyone. So that's kind of our view is, this is actually a super interesting toolkit, right, that just sort of lifts the gaming level, so. Right, exactly. And that dynamic is something that we think people are really going to get into, because then it's almost Minecraftian, right? Because then it's a whole new dynamic to explore, right? Even if your world is not changing that much, the way you interact with your bot and what you achieve with your agent in that world becomes really interesting, right? And so even in a world like Minecraft, right, where there isn't a specific stated reward function, you can have very specific goals for your agent, and it can become great at building you houses, right? So you could end up, put it to work kind of thing. So we think it's an interesting dynamic. So thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I think, go on then, but very quickly though, we'll have to wrap it up for the next panel. Go for it.
Can you use this as like user-generated content? Does the technology allow you to sort of transfer ownership of a bot to someone else?
It's funny. In the early days of conceptualizing this, we were looking at very much at that of saying, well, you know, you could actually put these agents, you could train a bot and then put those weights on the blockchain, right? And just sort of have this whole, and just say, hey, if somebody wants to use this bot, which is, you know, here's the score it's achieving in this game, if you want to play with that game. So one could, right? Because they're digital assets at the end of the day. So, and I think it opens up a lot of stuff like monetization in games. So if you want a, you know, the cloud, there could be a Cloud9 bot, right? That would have particular talents and skills. So I think for game developers, again, it's always this battle to take free to play and turn it into add layers that are relevant to the player. So I think that space is really interesting because then you can upsell, and you know, and give the player a really interesting experience. Like, wait a minute, it's not doing what I thought. Oh yeah, well, it's a Cloud9 bot. It's not going to, right? It's got its own